The morning her husband chose another woman, Eleanor Whitmore did not scream. She did not beg. She set down the winter coat she had been mending, the one with his initials sewn inside the lining, folded it across the back of the chair, and walked to the window. Outside, Nathaniel Ashford was helping Caroline Mercer down from his carriage like she was the most precious thing in Virginia. Eleanor watched. She did not cry, because some pain runs too deep for tears. It lives in the chest like a stone that never moves. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Virginia had not yet burned off its morning mist when the carriage came up the long drive of Ashford Estate. Eleanor heard the wheels on the gravel before she saw anything. She was sitting in the side parlor, not the grand one, the smaller one off the kitchen that nobody used anymore, with a boy's winter coat across her lap and a needle threaded with dark blue silk. The initials she was sewing were nearly finished. N. and Nathaniel Ashford, her husband's name. She had done this every winter for 6 years, sewn his name into things, into coat linings, into the corners of handkerchiefs, into the hem of a quilt she'd made the first winter they were married, when the cold came early, and they had only one good fire between them, and they hadn't minded at all. She heard the carriage stop. She did not get up. She had learned over the past 11 months not to get up when she heard carriages, not when the hour was past 9, and the name on the passenger manifest was never hers. Dora came in first. Dora always came in first when there was something the household didn't want Eleanor to hear from a stranger. Dora was 61 years old, had worked in the Whitmore family since Eleanor's mother was a girl, and had the kind of face that had stopped trying to lie somewhere around the age of 45. When she came through the door of the side parlor that morning and did not say anything right away, Eleanor knew. She kept sewing. "Miss Eleanor," Dora said. "I heard the carriage," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am." "How many people?" Dora's hands folded in front of her apron. "3, ma'am. Mr. Ashford, a lawyer by the name of Cutter, and—" She stopped. "And Miss Mercer," Eleanor said. The needle pulled through the fabric. N, almost done with the first letter. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor tied off the thread, set the coat down carefully on the chair beside her, stood up, smoothed the front of her dress, the gray one, the plain one, the one she wore when she wasn't expecting company, which was most mornings now. "Where are they?" "Grand dining room, ma'am. Mr. Ashford asked that the household be assembled." Eleanor looked at Dora. Dora looked back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that a man who wanted to speak to his household did not need a lawyer and a mistress to help him do it. "Tell them I'll be down in 10 minutes, Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am." Dora turned to go. "Dora." "Ma'am." Eleanor picked up the coat, held it out. "Finish the second initial for me, would you? The A. I've left the silk threaded." Dora took the coat. Her eyes went bright for just a moment, the kind of bright that comes before crying, and then she pressed it down. "I'll see to it," she said. Eleanor went upstairs. She did not take 10 minutes. She took 4. She washed her face with cold water from the basin, pinned her hair back the way she wore it when she meant business, and put on the small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Not the emerald ones. She hadn't worn the emerald ones since the night she found them missing from her jewelry case and understood without being told where they had gone. When she came downstairs, they were all waiting. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table. He was wearing his good coat, the dark one he kept for formal occasions, and he had shaved, which meant he had known this morning was coming, which meant he had not told her, which meant everything. She had been telling herself for 11 months about misunderstandings and pressure, and the difficulties of managing the estate was exactly what she had privately feared it was. A story she'd told herself so she wouldn't have to feel what she was feeling right now. Caroline Mercer stood 2 feet to Nathaniel's left. She was wearing a green dress the color of deep river water, and at her throat was the emerald necklace the one Eleanor had found missing, the one Nathaniel had promised her for their 5th anniversary, the one she had quietly stopped mentioning because she had not wanted to have the conversation that asking about it would require. The necklace looked beautiful on Caroline. Eleanor hated that she noticed that. The lawyer Cutter Dora had said was a thin man with wire spectacles and the look of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that it no longer touched him. He was sitting at the far end of the table with papers arranged in front of him, like he was about to conduct a business meeting, which Eleanor understood was exactly what this was. The rest of the household was there too. Thomas, the groundskeeper, Lena, the cook. 2 of the housemaids whose names Eleanor had taught herself in her first week at Ashford, because Nathaniel's mother had told her that a good mistress of a house knows the names of everyone in it. Old Samuel, who had tended the horses since before Nathaniel was born. They were all lined up along the wall, and not one of them would look at Eleanor directly, and that told her more than any lawyer's papers could. She walked to her seat, her usual seat, the one at Nathaniel's right hand, and she sat down. Nobody spoke. Nathaniel cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he said, "thank you for coming down." She looked at him. She waited. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say so many times that the words had lost all their weight. His jaw was set. His shoulders were back. He was performing composure so hard she could see the effort of it in the muscles of his neck. "I believe you understand," he said, "that the past year has been difficult, for both of us." Eleanor said nothing. The pressures of the estate, my father's passing, the debts that required restructuring. He glanced at Caroline. Caroline lifted her chin slightly. "I have come to believe that the path forward for Ashford Estate requires a different arrangement." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a horse stamped its foot in the yard. "I have asked Mr. Cutter here today," Nathaniel continued, "to present the terms of a legal separation. You would retain the property your father left you in Shenandoah County. A monthly income to be drawn from the estate revenues for the period of—" "Nathaniel," Eleanor said. He stopped. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the room, and something in the way she said his name quiet flat without any of the emotion he had clearly been braced for made him go very still. "Look at me," she said. He was already looking at her. What she meant was, "Look at me the way you used to before you decided I was a problem to be solved." He tried. She could see him trying. And she could see the exact moment he couldn't quite manage it, because his eyes moved just slightly involuntarily to Caroline. That was the moment Eleanor understood it completely, not with her mind. She had understood it with her mind for months, with her body, the place below the sternum where you know things before you're ready to know them. "Is this what you want?" she asked. "It is what is necessary," he said. "That isn't what I asked you." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Eleanor, I asked if it is what you want." The room was so quiet she could hear the fire in the next room through the closed door. Nathaniel's voice when it came was carefully controlled. "I believe Caroline is the person who can secure the future of Ashford Estate." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Caroline. Caroline met her eyes, without flinching. She had the composed expression of a woman who has won something, and is trying not to look like she knows it. She was 26 years old, and she had not one moment of uncertainty on her face, and Eleanor wondered briefly with something that was almost compassion whether Caroline understood what she had won. Whether she understood that a man who could look his wife in the eye and say, "She can secure the future instead of I love her," was not a man who was capable of being what either of them needed. Then she stopped wondering about Caroline and looked back at Nathaniel. "All right," Eleanor said. His brow pulled together. He had expected something else. Crying, maybe. Accusations. A scene he could manage by staying calm and letting her exhaust herself against his composure. "All right," he repeated. "I'll speak with Mr. Cutter," she said. "I'll review the terms. If they are fair, I will sign." She stood up. "But I want to say one thing to you before I do." Nathaniel said nothing. His hands, Eleanor noticed, were pressed flat on the table, pressing hard. She looked at him, at the man she had married at 22 years old in the chapel at her father's farm, in a dress her mother had helped her alter, because they couldn't afford a new one in front of 30 people who had genuinely believed the two of them were something worth witnessing, and she said, "You told me the night you proposed that you had never met anyone who made you want to be honest. Do you remember that?" Nathaniel's jaw moved. He didn't answer. "You said it was the rarest thing you'd ever found," Eleanor said. "Someone who didn't need you to perform. Someone you could be quiet with." She paused. "I hope you find that again someday, Nathaniel. I genuinely do. Because I don't think you've found it in this room." She looked at Caroline once more, just briefly. Then she nodded to the lawyer and she walked out. She did not cry until she was in the upstairs hallway with the door closed behind her, and even then it wasn't the kind of crying that makes noise. It was the kind that happens in the chest and the throat, while the face stays nearly still. The kind of crying that has no audience and doesn't want one. Dora was waiting at the top of the stairs. She had the coat in her hands. The initials were finished. N.A. Eleanor took the coat, held it. "Thank you," she said. "Where will you go, Miss Eleanor?" Dora's voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor thought about the Shenandoah property, her father's land. 40 acres of rocky hill country that had never been easy to farm and never been easy to love, but had always been hers. A falling down farmhouse with good bones and a well that had never gone dry. "Home," she said. It surprised her the way she meant it. She hadn't thought of the Shenandoah property as home in 6 years. She had thought of it as the place she came from, as the place that was less than what she'd married into, as something to be a little ashamed of at dinner parties when the other wives talked about their families' estates. She thought of it as home now. The word arrived in her chest like something unlocking. "When?" Dora asked. "A week," Eleanor said. "I need a week to put things in order." She pressed the coat against her chest, Nathaniel's initials against her heart, one last time. And then she folded it carefully and held it out to Dora. "Give this to Thomas's youngest boy," she said. "He's been borrowing his brother's coat all winter. It'll fit him better." Dora took the coat. She was not trying to keep her face steady anymore. She wasn't even trying. "You're the finest woman I've ever known," she said, "and I've known a great many women." Eleanor touched the older woman's hand, just briefly. "I'll write when I'm settled," she said. "I'd very much like to keep writing if you're willing." "Every week," Dora said. "Lord willing, and the creek don't rise." Eleanor almost smiled. Almost. The meeting with Mr. Cutter took 40 minutes. He was, as lawyers went, a fair one. Or at least a careful one. He had the look of a man who was not proud of every piece of work he did, but who was too old to start over. The terms Nathaniel had proposed were not generous. The monthly income was modest. The Shenandoah property would revert to Eleanor's ownership fully, but without support for improvements, and there was a clause she didn't like about the timing of the payments, but they were not cruel. Eleanor negotiated 3 changes. She asked for them quietly and specifically without theater, and when Cutter looked at her over his spectacles, with the expression of a man who had not expected to be negotiated with, she simply waited. He made the changes. She signed. As she set down the pen, Cutter gathered the papers and said without quite looking at her, "Mrs. Ashford, for what it's worth." He stopped there, seemed to reconsider, looked at her finally. "You conducted yourself with more dignity than most people manage on their best days," he said. "I've sat across this table from a great many people in difficult circumstances." Eleanor looked at the signature she had just written. Eleanor Whitmore. She had never taken Ashford as her own name, something she had been quietly teased about at social occasions, something that had always felt she understood now like a hand keeping hold of a rope. She looked up at the lawyer. "Do you have children, Mr. Cutter?" she asked. He blinked. "3 daughters, ma'am." "Teach them," she said, "that dignity isn't something a person gives you, and it isn't something they can take." She stood up, smoothed her dress, and offered her hand. "Good day." He shook it. He looked slightly undone. She did not see Nathaniel again before she left. She had expected to. She had half composed in the quiet hours of the nights that followed things she might say to him. Not cruel things. She did not want to be cruel, but honest things. The kind of honest that she had once been the only person willing to offer him, and that he had apparently decided he would rather live without. He did not seek her out. She packed the things that were hers, her books, her mother's quilts, the small portrait of her father, her garden tools, the pressed flowers she had collected from the Ashford meadows in better summers, and she did not take anything that was not hers. She did not take the portrait of herself and Nathaniel from the front hall, though it had been painted at her family's expense. She left it there. She told herself it was because she didn't want it. She almost believed that. On the 7th morning, she came downstairs before dawn. Her trunks had already been loaded. Old Samuel was handling the horses he had insisted quietly and without discussion on being the one to drive her to the Shenandoah Road. She had not argued. The household was there to see her off. All of them. Even the 2 young housemaids who had only been hired the previous autumn and barely knew her. They stood in the gray pre-dawn, and she walked down the line of them, and she said each name, and she shook each hand or pressed each shoulder, and when she got to Dora at the end, she held on for a moment. "Don't let him forget to eat when he's worried," Eleanor said quietly. "He forgets." Dora made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "I know," she said. "I've known it since he was 9 years old." Eleanor released her, lifted her chin, walked to the carriage. She did not look back at the house. She had made herself a rule about that sometime in the night. Do not look back at the house. Not because looking back would unmake her, she was past the point of being unmade, but because she wanted the last image she carried of Ashford Estate to be the one she chose, not the one that ambushed her. She had chosen it the day before, walking the grounds alone in the late afternoon. The kitchen garden, which she had redesigned 3 years ago, and which was just beginning to come in despite everything. The big oak at the edge of the south field that she had loved from the first time she saw it. The one with the branch that grew sideways like an outstretched arm. Those were hers. She was taking those with her. She got into the carriage. Samuel clicked to the horses. The wheels found the gravel drive, and everything began to move. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had been Eleanor Ashford in the mouths of this county's society for 6 years, though never on paper pressed her hands together in her lap, kept her eyes on the road ahead and did not look back. The Shenandoah farmhouse was worse than she remembered. The porch boards were rotting. A shutter had come off one of the upstairs windows. The kitchen garden had gone entirely to seed, and there were birds nesting in the old tobacco barn. The well rope had frayed to the point where another month would have snapped it. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her single trunk and looked at all of it. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She started with the well rope. By the end of the first week, she had the roof patched, the porch boards replaced, and 3 rows of late summer vegetables in the ground. By the end of the first month, she had hired 2 women from the neighboring farms. Both of them widows. Both of them excellent workers who had been struggling on their own and begun rebuilding what her father had always called the Southfield fence, which had been falling down for as long as Eleanor could remember. She wrote to Dora as she had promised. She wrote about the fence and the well and the birds in the barn. She had decided to let the birds stay in one corner of it because there was room enough for all of them. Dora wrote back about the weather and the garden and careful things about the household that told Eleanor everything she needed to know without telling her anything she'd asked not to be told. She did not ask about Nathaniel. Dora did not volunteer. In the evenings when the light came low through the farmhouse windows and the day's work was finished, Eleanor sat with her mother's quilts and her father's books and the sounds of the Shenandoah Valley going quiet around her, and she let herself grieve. Not every night. She was too tired most nights for anything but sleep. But some nights she let herself remember the early years Nathaniel's laugh, which she had loved, which she had made her whole mission to earn in the beginning, because it came so rarely and felt when it came like a window opening in a room that had been shut too long. She let herself remember the winter they'd been snowed in for 5 days and had played cards every evening, and he had cheated twice and admitted it immediately when she caught him, and she had laughed so hard she'd nearly fallen off her chair. She let herself miss him. The him that had been. And then she put the grief away. She was building something. She could feel it. The way you feel the shape of a thing before you can see it yet. She was building something, and she needed both hands. Child. It was Dora's letter, 9 months after Eleanor had left Ashford, that first mentioned the name William Mercer. She hadn't asked. Dora had offered it carefully folded into news about the kitchen garden and old Samuel's knee acting up. There have been difficulties, Dora had written. Mr. Mercer. Miss Mercer's father has taken a strong interest in the management of the estate finances. Some of the men have been uneasy. I say only what I observe, Miss Eleanor, and I observe that the house is not what it was. Eleanor read the letter twice, then she set it aside. She did not write back about William Mercer. She wrote about the Southfield, which was producing better than expected. She wrote about the school she had begun, just a room in the farmhouse 3 days a week, 6 children from neighboring farms, because there was no schoolhouse within 8 miles, and the nearest schoolmaster charged more than any of the families could easily manage. She wrote that she was well. That part, at least, was becoming true. There were still mornings she woke reaching for a life that was no longer there. Still moments when a sound or a smell or the angle of afternoon light through a particular window caught her somewhere undefended, and she had to stand very still and breathe through it. But there were also mornings, more of them now arriving more reliably, when she woke up, and the first thing she felt was simply here. Present. Herself. Inhabiting her own life without the constant low-grade grief of trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less honest, less herself. She had not known until it was gone how much of herself she had been quietly setting aside. Not all at once, a little at a time. The way you don't notice a room getting darker until someone opens a curtain. Someone had opened a curtain. The light was different now. Sharper. Sometimes it was too sharp, and she had to look away. But it was real. She was building something. And Nathaniel Ashford, 4 counties away, was beginning, though Eleanor did not yet know this, to understand what he had torn down. The first letter from Dora arrived on a Tuesday 6 weeks after Eleanor left Ashford Estate. It was not a long letter. Dora had never been a woman who wasted words on paper any more than she wasted them in conversation. 3 pages written in the careful, slightly tilted hand of someone who had taught herself to write as an adult and never quite lost the effortfulness of it. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee still in her work clothes, her hair not yet pinned. The letter told her about the garden, about old Samuel's knee which was improving, about the 2 housemaids, Mary and Ruth, who had been arguing over the linen cupboard schedule in a way that had required Dora's intervention twice in 1 week, about the fact that the big oak at the edge of the south field had lost a branch in the July storm, though the tree itself was sound. It did not mention Nathaniel. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she set it on the windowsill where she could see it while she worked, the way she used to set flowers there, and she wrote back that afternoon. She wrote about the well rope she had replaced, about the widow women she had hired, Margaret Foss, who had lost her husband to a fever the previous winter, and June Aldrich, whose husband had simply walked away one morning 3 years ago and never come back, which Eleanor privately thought was its own kind of death. She wrote about the Southfield, and the late vegetables, and the birds in the tobacco barn. She did not ask about Nathaniel either. That first exchange established the grammar of their correspondence, and both of them understood it without discussing it. They would write about work, and weather, and small human dignities. They would not write about Ashford Estate's new domestic arrangements. They would not write about the woman wearing Eleanor's emerald necklace. What they would do without ever saying so directly was keep each other company. Eleanor had not known before she left how much she would need that. August came in hot and brutal, the way Virginia August always did. Like the summer had finally decided to stop being polite about it. The farmhouse had no shade on the south side she had plans for that eventually. Trees she wanted to plant. And by midday, the kitchen became almost unbearable. Eleanor started getting up before 4 to do her indoor work before the heat arrived, and spending the worst hours of the afternoon in the tobacco barn with Margaret and June, mending harnesses and sorting seed, and doing the kinds of tasks that could be done sitting in the relative cool of the old building, while the birds watched from their corner with their small, skeptical eyes. It was during one of those August afternoons that Margaret Foss, without looking up from the harness she was working on, said, "Can I ask you something personal, Mrs. Whitmore?" "You can ask," Eleanor said. "I might not answer." "Fair enough." Margaret worked the leather through her hands. She was a compact woman in her mid-30s, with the direct, undecorated manner of someone who had stopped caring about social niceties somewhere around the time she was left alone with 4 children and a half-worked farm. Eleanor liked her immediately and completely. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Wake up every morning and—" Margaret made a small gesture with the harness that seemed to encompass the farmhouse. The fields, the whole complicated project of Eleanor's existence. "Just keep building. When the thing you built before got taken." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "It didn't get taken?" she said finally. "I signed the papers. I chose to sign them." "That ain't the same as wanting to." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It ain't." June, who was older and quieter and rarely volunteered opinions unless she had decided they were worth the breath, looked up from her seed sorting. "My grandmother used to say," she said, "that a woman's got to decide what she's the kind of woman who does. Not what she feels. What she does. Feelings are weather. What you do is the house." Eleanor turned that over in her mind. "Your grandmother sounds like she knew some hard winters," she said. 7 children, June said. She outlived 4 of them. She went back to her seeds. She was the kind of woman who kept building. Eleanor thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it in the evening when she sat with her father's books, and the quiet that had become slowly and incompletely something she could inhabit rather than something she endured. She thought about what kind of woman she was going to be. Not what kind of woman she felt like on the mornings when the grief came in sideways and caught her off guard. What kind of woman she was going to do. The school was June's idea, though Eleanor had been thinking about it separately. "Those Alderton children walk 3 miles to the Reed farm for lessons," June said one morning. "And the Reeds are barely teaching. Old Mr. Reed can't read much himself, just enough to get by." "I know it," Eleanor said. "You taught yourself Latin," June said. "I've seen the books." "My father taught me," Eleanor said. "I finished on my own." "Same thing?" June looked at her with the patient expression of a woman who had already arrived at the conclusion and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "You've got the room, you've got the mornings. Those children have nothing." Eleanor opened the school the first Monday of September. 6 children the first week, 8 the second. By October, she had 11 ranging in age from 5 to 14, and she had written to her cousin in Philadelphia asking if he knew of any basic primers that could be had cheaply, because she had already lent out her last copy of the one she owned, and she needed more. Her cousin sent 6. He also sent a note saying he was proud of her, which she read standing at the mailbox, and then had to sit down and breathe through for a moment before she could walk back to the house. Sus. The second of Dora's letters arrived in September, and this one was different. Not in what it said, it still observed the established grammar, still covered garden and weather and small household events. But between the lines and the slight compression of Dora's usually unhurried sentences, Eleanor felt something. The way you feel a change in air pressure before the storm arrives. "The harvest has been managed differently this year," Dora had written. "Mr. Cutter came twice in August for meetings I was not present at. Thomas tells me the South Pasture leases are being renegotiated, though I don't know the particulars. I would not trouble you with household business. Miss Eleanor, only. I know you have an understanding of these things that I lack, and I find myself curious whether what I observe is of the ordinary sort." Eleanor read that paragraph 4 times. Then she went to her father's desk, the old oak one she'd brought from the farmhouse's back room, the one her father had done all his estate correspondence at for 30 years, and she wrote back to Dora asking 3 specific questions. Who was present at the August meetings besides Cutter? Whether William Mercer had been to the estate in person. Whether the men on the lease farm seemed easy or uneasy. She sent the letter the next morning and waited. Dora's reply came back in 10 days. William Mercer had been to Ashford Estate 4 times since Eleanor left. He had taken dinner with Nathaniel twice. The South Pasture tenants, 3 families who had leased that land for a combined total of nearly 40 years, had been told their renewal terms were changing. 2 of them had come to Thomas asking questions Thomas did not know how to answer. Mr. Ashford seems to rely considerably on Mr. Mercer's counsel, Dora had written. I say this carefully, Miss Eleanor, because I do not wish to speak ill of my employer or his choices. But I have kept this house for 20 years, and I know what the house feels like when it is easy and when it is not. It does not feel easy. Eleanor sat with that letter for a long evening. She was not Nathaniel's wife anymore. She had signed the papers. The South Pasture tenants were not her responsibility. The estate finances were not her concern. William Mercer's interest in Ashford's books was someone else's problem to solve. She told herself all of this very clearly and sensibly. And then she wrote to her cousin in Philadelphia, the same one who had sent the primers, and asked him as casually as she could manage whether he had ever heard the name William Mercer in his business dealings, and what manner of man he understood him to be. She told herself she was merely curious. She almost believed it. It was October before she heard back, and what her cousin wrote changed the quality of the air in the farmhouse in a way Eleanor felt in her chest before she finished reading. William Mercer, her cousin, had written, is a man I would advise any person of sense to approach with considerable caution. He built his fortune in land speculation in the years following the war, and while nothing has ever been proved, there have been questions, quiet ones. The kind that don't make it to courts about the instruments by which certain properties changed hands. He is charming, and he is well connected, and he does not make enemies quickly, which is either a virtue or a strategy, depending on how you choose to look at it. 2 men I know in the Philadelphia Exchange have declined to do business with him without giving specific reasons, which, in my experience, is itself a specific reason. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the locked drawer of her father's desk, where she kept documents she needed to keep safe. She sat for a long time at the desk without moving. What Nathaniel had told himself she understood was that William Mercer was a solution. His father's death had left the estate carrying debts that the previous generation had hidden under careful management and comfortable borrowing. Caroline Mercer had appeared precisely when Nathaniel was most frightened, and Nathaniel, frightened, was a man who grabbed for what looked solid, even when what looked solid was offered by someone who had very specific reasons for offering it. She did not feel triumphant about understanding this. She felt tired and a little sad, and something else she didn't immediately have a name for. It took her until evening to find the word. Grief. Again. Different shape this time. Not grief for her marriage, not exactly. Grief for the Nathaniel she had known, the one who had been underneath all his pride and all his fear genuinely good. The one who had bought a butter churn for a tenant family who lost theirs in a fire without telling anyone he'd done it, because he didn't want thanks, he just wanted them to have a butter churn. The one who had stayed up all night with the youngest of the lease farmer's children when the boy had a bad fever and the family had no one else. That man was somewhere inside the one who had just handed his estate over to William Mercer's management. She hoped he was still findable. She wrote that night to Dora, watch the books if you can. Not intrusively, just observe. And write to me if anything changes quickly. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours, listening to the Shenandoah Valley breathe in the dark. November arrived with cold that came in from the north like it meant it, and Eleanor spent the first week of the month getting the farmhouse ready for winter in a way it hadn't been properly prepared in years. She stuffed the window gaps. She checked the flue. She laid in wood with Margaret's help and restacked it twice until it was right. She was not going to be caught cold in her own house. The school met 4 mornings a week now. She had added Thursday after 2 of the older children asked politely and directly, in the manner of children who have been taught to ask for what they need, whether there might be another morning because they were falling behind on their figures, and she was the only person they knew who could help them catch up. She had added Thursday. There was a boy named Caleb, 11 years old, who had arrived on the first day of school unable to read a word, and who by November was reading haltingly but improving, and who had the stubborn, furious intelligence of someone who had always known the capacity was there and had simply been waiting for someone to unlock the door to it. Eleanor liked him so much, it was sometimes difficult to keep her face appropriately teacher-like when he worked out a problem. She wrote to Dora about Caleb. Not about the estate finances, not about William Mercer, not about the locked drawer and its contents. Just about this boy who was learning to read with the intensity of someone who understood at 11 years old that literacy was the kind of possession no one could take from you. Dora wrote back, "He sounds like someone I would like very much. Send him my regards, though he won't know who I am." Eleanor sent him the regards. She told him an old woman in another county had expressed admiration for his progress. Caleb looked up from his primer with complete seriousness and said, "Tell her thank you, ma'am. I intend to be worth admiring." Eleanor managed to keep her face appropriately teacher-like until he looked back down. Then she let herself smile. The letter that changed everything came on the 4th of December, and it came not from Dora, but from Thomas. Thomas, the groundskeeper, had never in Eleanor's knowledge written a letter to anyone. He was not a literary man. He was a man who communicated through action and through the precise, economical language of someone who had spent 40 years working outdoors and had never seen the point of saying 4 words when 2 would serve. His letter was 6 sentences long, and it said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I write because I don't know who else to write to, and Dora said you would want to know. Mr. Mercer's men came Tuesday and removed the deed documents from the estate records room. Mr. Ashford was not present. When he returned and was told I heard him and Mr. Mercer in the study for 1 hour, he has not come out of the house since." Eleanor read it standing at the mailbox in the December cold. She read it again. Then she went inside, and she sat down at her father's desk, and she put her hands flat on the surface of it, and she breathed. The deed documents. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what a man like William Mercer would want with the deed documents of Virginia's largest private estate. She thought about what it meant that Nathaniel had not been present. She thought about what Nathaniel had come home to find, and what he had said to William Mercer in that study for 1 hour, and what it meant that he had not come out since. She thought about the man who had bought a butter churn for a family he barely knew. She unlocked the drawer and took out her cousin's letter and read it again slowly. Then she got up. She told Margaret and June that she needed to go to town and that she might be gone until evening. She asked June to handle the school in the morning. June had been sitting in on lessons for 2 weeks now, and Eleanor trusted her completely with the younger children. She put on her good coat, the gray wool one with the brass buttons that her mother had made her bring when she left home, because you'll need to look like you know what you're doing. Eleanor, even on the days you're not sure. She walked the 3 miles to the county clerk's office in Woodstock. She was not sure yet what she was going to do with what she found there, but she was the kind of woman who kept building. June's grandmother had said so, or something like it, and the first thing you had to know before you could build anything was what you were actually working with. The county clerk was a small man named Abbott, who smelled of pipe tobacco, and who looked at Eleanor over his own spectacles with the mild wariness of a man who had learned that women who arrived alone and asked to see property records were usually either lawyers' wives or trouble. "I'd like to review the recorded deeds for the Ashford estate properties," Eleanor said. "I have a prior interest in those records." She set her father's name on the table, the legal documents from her marriage, which she had brought because she had known she might need them. "I have standing." Abbott looked at the documents. He looked at her. He went and got the records. Eleanor sat at the small table in the records room, and she went through them with the same careful, systematic attention she had applied to the estate books during the 6 years she'd managed the household at Ashford, when Nathaniel had trusted her with the accounts because she was better at them than he was, and he had been in those years wise enough to know it. What she found took her 40 minutes to piece together completely. When she understood it, she sat very still for a moment. Then she asked Abbott very politely for a sheet of paper and permission to copy 3 specific documents. He gave her both. She copied them by hand carefully and exactly. She thanked Abbott. She walked back out into the December cold. She had walked almost a mile before she let herself process what she had just learned. William Mercer had been acquiring Ashford Estate not all at once. Nothing so obvious. Piece by piece. A mortgage here, a lien there recorded instruments of debt that had been filed quietly over the past 8 months by a lawyer Eleanor did not recognize, but whose name she was going to look up the moment she got home. Some of the instruments bore Nathaniel's signature. Some of them bore signatures that were so close to Nathaniel's that you would not question them if you were not looking for a reason to question them. Eleanor was looking. She was looking, and she could see the shape of it. The instruments that bore the 2 close signatures had all been recorded on dates when she knew, because Dora had mentioned in letters the ordinary rhythms of the estate, that Nathaniel had been away. Traveling for business. At the Henrico courthouse. Visiting his mother's family in the Piedmont. The instruments that Nathaniel had signed himself were the ones from the early months before the relationship with the Mercers had curdled into something else. Those were probably real. Those were probably the ones Nathaniel had signed believing he was restructuring legitimate debts with the help of a man who wished him well. The later ones were different. Eleanor walked the last mile home in the early dark with the copied documents folded in her coat and her mind moving very fast and very cold, the way it had moved during the worst moments of her marriage when she had needed to be clear-headed and there had been no room for anything but clarity. She was not Nathaniel's wife. What happened to Ashford Estate was not her problem. She had told herself this before, and she was telling herself again and again it was true, and again it didn't seem to matter. Because William Mercer was not going to stop at Ashford Estate. Men like William Mercer never stopped. They moved from one property to the next like a drought moves across land, taking what they could carry and leaving the rest too damaged to recover. And because the South Pasture tenants, the 3 families who had farmed that land for 40 years, had nothing to do with Nathaniel Ashford's pride, or his mistakes, or his choices. They were just people trying to hold on to what little they had. And because Eleanor Whitmore was the kind of woman who kept building. She sat down at her father's desk and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to her cousin in Philadelphia, the one with business contacts, the one who had sent the primers and the information about William Mercer. She told him what she had found in the county records. She asked him for the name of the most reliable lawyer he knew, who had experience with fraudulent land instruments. The second was to Thomas. She told him to watch and to write, and to tell her everything he observed, no matter how small. The third was to Dora. She sat with Dora's letter for a long time before she started writing. She thought about what to say. She thought about what she owed, and what she didn't owe, and what the difference was in practice when you were the kind of person she was. She wrote, "Tell me how he is." Just that. She sealed the letter and left it with the others, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, as outside the December wind was working at the farmhouse windows, the way the cold always did, probing for gaps, looking for the places that hadn't been properly sealed. Eleanor had stuffed every gap she could find. She had spent a week on it. There were always gaps you hadn't found yet. That was the thing about winter. It always found the ones you missed. She picked up the letters and held them. 3 envelopes, 3 directions, and underneath all of them, not quite acknowledged the question she had not yet let herself ask directly, whether the man she had once loved with the entirety of her heart was already lost inside the disaster that was closing around him, or whether there was still time. Whether there was still something worth finding. She did not answer the question. She was not ready to answer it. She sealed the envelopes and went to bed. In the morning, she was going to plant the trees on the south side of the farmhouse, the ones she had been planning since August. It was late in the season, too late some would say, but Eleanor had spent enough time around growing things to know that too late was mostly a thing people said when they were too tired to try. She put the lamp out. The dark settled around the farmhouse like something familiar, like the kind of dark that was not empty but full of the small sounds of a winter night, the creak of the old wood, the far-off call of something she couldn't name, and Eleanor lay in it and breathed and let the day go and waited for morning. The trees went in on a Thursday. Eleanor had chosen 3 young chestnuts from a nursery 2 towns over, hauled them back in the wagon bed wrapped in burlap, and planted them herself along the south wall of the farmhouse, with Margaret holding the stakes and June calling out whether they were straight. It was cold work December. Cold, the kind that gets into your knuckles and stays there. Eleanor's hands ached for 2 days afterward. She didn't regret it. You planted trees in the cold if you wanted shade in the summer. That was just how time worked. The replies to her 3 letters came back in stages the way answers always do when the questions are complicated. Thomas wrote first 5 days after she had sent to him. His second letter was longer than his first 6 sentences, had apparently broken some internal dam, because this one ran to nearly 2 pages in the same terse factual voice, but with more of it. Nathaniel had come out of the house. He had confronted William Mercer directly, which had resulted in Mercer leaving the estate in what Thomas described as a controlled manner that was not friendly. Nathaniel had then spent 3 days going through the estate records room. Thomas did not know what he had found, but he knew that Nathaniel had sent for Mr. Cutter on the 4th day, and that Cutter had been there for 4 hours, and that when Cutter left, he had the look of a man who had just been handed a problem he was not sure he could solve. Eleanor read Thomas's letter at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Then she read it again. She felt something complicated move through her. Not satisfaction. She had never wanted Nathaniel to be ruined, had never wanted any of this, but something adjacent to relief. The man who had bought a butter churn for a tenant family was still in there somewhere. He had come out of the house. He had confronted William Mercer. He was going through the records. He was beginning to see what she had already seen. The question was whether he was seeing it in time. Her cousin's letter arrived 4 days later, and it contained the name of a lawyer, a man named Harlan Booth, practicing out of Richmond, with experience in exactly the kind of fraudulent land instruments Eleanor had found in the county records. Her cousin described him as difficult, expensive, and exceptionally good, which Eleanor understood to mean he was worth whatever he cost. She wrote to Harlan Booth that same afternoon. January came in gray and relentless, and Eleanor was glad of the work. The school kept her mornings structured. The farm kept her afternoons physical. The correspondence Dora Thomas, her cousin, and now the careful formal exchanges with Harlan Booth, who wrote in the clipped language of a man who billed by the hour and intended you to understand, that kept her evenings occupied in a way that left less room for the thinking that led nowhere. It was Dora's January letter that told her about Caroline, not directly. Dora never said anything directly if there was a sideways approach available, and Eleanor had come to understand this as a form of kindness rather than evasion. But she had asked back in December for Dora to tell her how Nathaniel was, and Dora had taken 2 weeks to think about how to answer that. And what she had arrived at was this: he is not the same as he was. I do not mean worse, Miss Eleanor. I mean different. He has been going over his father's papers. He has been riding the lease farms himself, which he has not done regularly since the first year after his father passed. He dismissed 2 of the men Mr. Mercer had placed in positions here, which was not comfortable, but was, I believe, correct. As to the other matter, Miss Mercer has not been to the estate since November. I say only what I observe. Eleanor read that paragraph 3 times. Miss Mercer has not been to the estate since November. She was surprised by how little she felt about that. She had expected something, some flicker of satisfaction or grief, or the bittersweet vindication of a woman whose predictions have been proven right. Instead, what she felt was mostly tired, and something quieter beneath the tired. Something that was almost, she tested the word carefully, pity. Not for Nathaniel, or not only for Nathaniel. For Caroline, who had wanted a position, and had gotten one, and had discovered, as people who want positions generally do, that what you get when you reach for a man's title is the title, and whatever comes with it, which is never quite what you imagined when you were reaching. She did not write any of this to Dora. She wrote about Caleb, who had read his first full page without stopping, and about the chestnut trees on the south wall, and about Margaret's eldest daughter, who had started coming to the school, and who had at 7 years old the most ferocious mathematical instinct Eleanor had ever encountered in a child. She sealed the letter. She sat a moment. Then she opened it again and added at the bottom, "Tell him the deed records in Woodstock are worth his attention. He'll know what I mean if he's been going through the papers properly. Don't tell him I said so. Just tell him." She sealed it again. Sent it. She told herself it was just information. The kind of information any decent person with relevant knowledge would pass along. She almost believed it. February brought the first real crisis. It arrived not as a letter, but as a person, a man named Robert Alderton, father of 2 of Eleanor's school children, who showed up at her door on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and the look of someone who had been rehearsing what he was going to say all the way there and had still not gotten it right. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm sorry to come without writing first." "Come in," Eleanor said. "I'll put coffee on." He sat at her kitchen table with the hat on his knees and told her that William Mercer's lawyer had contacted 3 of the South pasture tenants, the families who had leased that land for 40 years, with new terms. Terms that included an immediate payment of arrears that none of them had known they owed in an amount that none of them could pay due within 60 days. "The papers say Mr. Ashford's signature," Robert said. "But I've seen Mr. Ashford's signature on my lease. I've had it for 11 years. And this one don't look quite right to me." He pressed his hat between his hands. "I didn't know who to go to, ma'am. I didn't know if I had any right to come here." Eleanor set the coffee down. She sat across from him. She looked at a man who had farmed the same 40 acres of Virginia soil for 11 years, who had 3 children, who had come 3 miles in February cold on a Tuesday morning, because he had no one else to ask. And she thought about what it meant to be the kind of woman who kept building versus the kind of woman who watched things fall. "May I see the papers?" she said. He pulled them from inside his coat. She read them at the kitchen table carefully, the same way she had read the county records in December. She compared the signature to the one she remembered from Cutter's documents. She took her time. When she was done, she looked up at Robert Alderton and said, "That signature is not Nathaniel Ashford's." Robert went very still. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," she said. "I was married to the man for 6 years, and I have seen that signature on more documents than I can count. That is not his hand." Robert's jaw worked. He looked at the papers. He looked back at her. "What do I do?" Eleanor was already standing, already moving toward her father's desk. "You do nothing yet," she said. "You go home and you tell the other 2 families the same thing I just told you. Don't sign anything, don't pay anything, don't respond to anything until you hear from me. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Robert." She stopped, turned back. "Don't tell anyone you came here, not yet." He nodded. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been pulled back from the edge of something and is not entirely sure yet what the edge was. "I didn't know who else to ask," he said again. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm glad you came." She wrote to Harlan Booth in Richmond that same afternoon. She enclosed copies of the Alderton documents alongside the records she had already sent him. She wrote clearly and specifically about what she had found, what she believed it meant, and what she believed needed to happen. Booth's reply came back in 8 days, which was fast for February roads, which told her he agreed about the urgency. He had found 4 additional fraudulent instruments in the Richmond records that she had not yet located. He named them, described them, and explained in his clipped, billing-by-the-hour language exactly what the pattern indicated. William Mercer Booth wrote had done this before. Not in Virginia. In Kentucky 6 years prior. He had targeted a large estate, whose owner was carrying inherited debt, had positioned himself as a financial ally, had systematically acquired encumbrances on the property through a combination of legitimate instruments signed by the owner and fraudulent ones signed by Mercer's own lawyer using a practiced approximation of the owner's hand. By the time the owner understood what had happened, enough of the property was legally compromised that extricating it had taken 2 years and cost nearly as much as the encumbrances themselves. The Kentucky matter, Booth wrote, was settled privately, and the instruments were never challenged in court. Mr. Mercer has relied in subsequent operations on the likelihood that the injured party will prefer the expense of a private settlement to the exposure of a public legal proceeding. He is not wrong to calculate this way. Most people make that choice. Eleanor read that paragraph twice. Then she wrote back, "I am not most people. What do we need for court?" Booth's response to that was by his standards almost warm. "I will need the original county records, a comparison signature from Mr. Ashford, and a witness to the dates of Mr. Ashford's absence from the estate, who can confirm he was not present when the fraudulent instruments were recorded. I will handle the rest." Eleanor put the letter in the locked drawer. She sat for a long time at her father's desk. A comparison signature from Nathaniel. A witness to his absence. Both of those things required someone at Ashford Estate to cooperate. Someone who was willing to put their name to something that would put William Mercer in front of a judge. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Dora. She thought about Nathaniel. Because Nathaniel's cooperation was not just useful, it was, Booth had implied, essential. A challenge to the fraudulent instruments had much more force if it came from the property owner himself. Without Nathaniel, she could bring what she had to a judge and make the case on the merits, but Mercer's lawyers would fight it, and the fight would be long and expensive and uncertain. With Nathaniel, it was different. With Nathaniel, it was the property owner himself standing up in court and saying, "I did not sign these documents. I was not present on these dates. This man stole from me." She closed her eyes. She had not spoken to Nathaniel since the morning she walked out of the dining room at Ashford Estate. She had not written to him. She had not sent word through Dora or Thomas. She had maintained with considerable discipline the clean line she had drawn between his life and hers. What she was contemplating now would erase that line completely. She opened her eyes. She got up and she went to the kitchen and she started the fire for supper because she needed to do something with her hands while she thought, and she had learned over the past 8 months that thinking went better when her hands were occupied. She made soup. She made it carefully the way her mother had taught her, with attention. She thought about Robert Alderton and his hat and his 3 children and his 40 acres. She thought about the other 2 families on the south pasture. She thought about the man in Kentucky whose estate had taken 2 years and a private settlement to rescue, and whether that man had wished after the fact that he had chosen the court instead. She ate supper. She washed the bowl. She went back to her father's desk. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to Harlan Booth, telling him to proceed with the preparation for a legal challenge and to expect that she would have a comparison signature within 2 weeks. The second letter was the hardest thing she had written since she signed the separation papers. It was addressed to Nathaniel Ashford. It was 4 sentences long. "I am aware of what William Mercer has been doing with your estate. I have been working with a lawyer in Richmond who can help you if you want help. What we need from you is your cooperation and your courage, and I want to be clear that I am not asking you for anything else. If you are willing, please write to me." She read it over. She changed nothing. She sealed it, addressed it, and added it to the stack of letters going out in the morning. Then she went to bed, and lay in the dark, and listened to the February wind, and waited for morning to come, the way she had learned to wait for things without rushing toward them, without flinching back from them, just letting them arrive. His reply came in 9 days. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she opened it. 6 years had not made Nathaniel's hand unfamiliar to her. It was the same angular, slightly rushed script she had seen on estate documents and household notes, and once a letter he had left on her pillow when she was ill and he had not known what else to do. A letter that had said in its entirety, "I am sorry you are not well. I will be downstairs if you need anything." N. She had kept that letter for 2 years before she finally let herself admit that a man who could not bring himself to sit with his sick wife but left notes on her pillow was showing her something true about himself, and that she had been declining to read it. She opened this letter at the kitchen table. Alone. She had sent Margaret and June out to the south field on purpose. It was longer than 4 sentences. It was, in fact, the longest letter she had ever received from Nathaniel Ashford, who was not a man who found writing easy or comfortable or natural. The length of it told her something before she read a word of it. He had found the Woodstock records. Dora had passed along her message, and he had gone himself to the county clerk and looked, and what he had found had confirmed what he was already beginning to suspect. He had been a fool. He wrote that word directly without softening it, a fool. He had been frightened after his father's death, and he had made decisions from that fear without examining them the way he should have. And William Mercer had read his fear the way a skilled hunter reads terrain, and had walked straight through it. He wrote about Caroline. He wrote carefully with something that was not cruelty toward her, but was very clear. She did not deceive me in ways I was not willing to be deceived. I want to be honest about that. She was what she was. I chose not to see it, because seeing it would have required me to look at everything else I was refusing to see. And I was not at that time a man who was capable of that. Eleanor read that paragraph slowly. Then she kept reading. He wrote that he had dismissed Mercer 3 months ago, as Thomas had reported, but that he had not yet understood the full scope of the damage until he received Eleanor's letter. He had spent the 9 days since writing to her going through every document in the estate records room. He had found what she had told him to look for. He had found more besides. He wrote, "I do not know what I deserve in this circumstance. I am not writing to ask for your compassion or your forgiveness. I am writing because you offered help and because the South Pasture tenants are people who have done nothing wrong, and if there is a way to protect them from what Mercer intended, then I want to take that way, regardless of the cost to my own pride or my own standing. Tell me what your lawyer needs." And then, at the very bottom of the letter, after his signature in writing, that was slightly different from the rest, less controlled, more like the penmanship of a man writing quickly before he could change his mind, he had added, "I have thought about what you said to me that morning, about honesty. I think you were right. I think I have known for some time that you were right, and I have found it difficult to sit with that knowledge. I am trying to learn to sit with it." Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, the February wind was at the windows again. The chestnut trees on the south wall were bare, barely more than sticks in the cold ground. You had to know what they were going to become to see them as anything but sticks. She picked up her pen. She wrote to Nathaniel, "I'll have Mr. Booth contact you directly. Cooperate with him completely and honestly. That is all I need from you right now." She paused. She looked at what she had written. Then she added, "The South Pasture families came to me in January. They trusted you with 40 years of their lives. Honor that." She sealed it. She addressed it. She put it with the morning letters. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was troubled exactly. Because the thing she had been holding at careful arm's length for 8 months was now in motion, and motion changes the nature of things, and she was not yet sure what this motion was going to become. March arrived, and Harlan Booth arrived with it. Not to Shenandoah, to Ashford Estate. He had written Eleanor that he preferred to meet with Nathaniel in person and review the documents directly, and that he would write to her from Richmond when he had a clearer picture of the proceedings. His letter came at the end of March. It was by the standards of Booth's billing-by-the-hour prose, almost verbose. He had spent 2 days at Ashford. He had reviewed every document. He had taken Nathaniel's sworn statement and compared it against the dates in the county records. The fraudulent instruments were unambiguous once you knew what you were looking at, and Booth clearly knew what he was looking at. He had also, and this was the detail that stopped Eleanor's breath for a moment, found the connection to Kentucky. A former associate of Mercer's had become disenchanted enough with the man to be willing to speak, and what he was willing to say about the Kentucky matter aligned with every suspicion Booth had formed. We have Booth wrote an exceptionally strong case. I would estimate the probability of a favorable outcome in front of a Virginia Circuit Court at something better than 9 in 10, assuming Mr. Ashford presents himself well, which on the basis of my 2 days with him, I believe he will. He is not what I expected." Eleanor read that last sentence twice. He is not what I expected. She wondered what Booth had expected. She wondered what Nathaniel had said or done that had moved a lawyer who billed by the hour and expressed admiration for almost nothing to write those 5 words in an official case correspondence. She wrote back asking for a court date and requesting to be informed of all developments. Booth replied with a date the 15th of May. Eleanor looked at that date. She put the letter in the locked drawer with everything else. She sat at her father's desk for a long time. May 15th, 4 counties away in the Hanover courthouse. William Mercer brought before a Virginia Circuit Court judge with fraudulent instruments and a Kentucky witness and a property owner who was willing to stand up and say, "I know what you did, and I am not going to be quiet about it." She was not the one standing up. She would not be in the courtroom. She would be here in Shenandoah County with the school and the farm and the chestnut trees that were all ready. She had noticed that morning beginning to show the very first faint signs of budding. That was right. That was how it should be. She was not doing this for Nathaniel. She was doing it for Robert Alderton and his hat and his 40 acres and his 3 children who came to her school 3 mornings a week and who deserved to keep the life they had. She was doing it because she was the kind of woman who kept building, and sometimes building meant refusing to let someone else tear things down. She told herself this clearly. She believed it. She also, in the quiet of the late March evening with the fire burning low, and the locked drawer holding its contents, and the chestnut trees putting out their first cautious buds in the cold, allowed herself to think about Nathaniel Ashford, the real one, the complicated one, the one who left notes on pillows and bought butter churns for strangers, and had apparently said something to a Richmond lawyer in 2 days that made a man who was impressed by almost nothing sit down and write, "He is not what I expected." And she allowed herself to hope, not for herself, or not only. For the man who was by every account she had been able to gather, beginning slowly, painfully, without any of the grace or ease that he had always expected from himself, to become someone worth hoping for. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark. May 15th. The chestnut trees were putting out buds. She let herself believe they were going to reach the light. The 15th of May came and went without Eleanor in the courtroom. She had not planned to go. She had been clear with herself about that from the beginning. This was Nathaniel's fight to stand up in his name on the deed documents, his estate, his testimony that Booth needed. Her role had been preparation, evidence, the locked drawer and the copied records, and the letter to a Richmond lawyer who billed by the hour and had in the end built something solid out of everything she had quietly handed him. She spent the 15th of May teaching school. Caleb read an entire page of his primer aloud that morning without stopping once, and when he finished, he looked up at Eleanor with the expression of someone who has just discovered they are capable of something they weren't sure about. And Eleanor said, "Good," in a voice that came out steadier than she expected, given that her hands were pressed flat against her knees under the table to keep them still. She did not receive word from Booth until the 19th, 4 days. She had told herself she would not count the days. She counted every one. His letter arrived on a Thursday morning while Margaret was in the South Field, and June was settling the younger children at their slates, and Eleanor was at her father's desk, pretending to review accounts. She heard the postwriter on the road, and she was at the door before she had made a conscious decision to move. She took the letter inside. She sat down. She opened it. Booth's letters were always controlled, precise, the language of a man who chose every word the way a carpenter chooses a joint for fit and function, nothing decorative. This one was the same, and yet the first line told her everything before she had finished reading the page. The court found in Mr. Ashford's favor on all counts. She sat with those 8 words for a long moment. Then she kept reading. The hearing had lasted 2 days. Booth had presented the fraudulent instruments alongside the comparison signatures, the county record dates, and Thomas's sworn account of Nathaniel's whereabouts on each relevant occasion. The Kentucky witness, a former business associate of Mercer's, named Clement Ford, had traveled to Hanover and had testified with a directness that Booth described as more effective than I anticipated, given that men in his position generally prove less reliable under questioning than they appear in private. William Mercer had attended with 2 lawyers of his own. He had been composed throughout the first day. By the second day, when Clement Ford was finished and the fraudulent instruments were laid alongside the authenticated ones in front of the judge, Mercer's composure had developed what Booth called visible structural failures. The judge had ruled without lengthy deliberation. The fraudulent instruments were voided. The encumbrances on the South Pasture leases were released. Mercer had been referred to the county sheriff for further inquiry into the matter of the forgeries, which was not the same as criminal prosecution, but was, Booth noted, a beginning. Nathaniel had conducted himself, Booth wrote, with complete honesty, and without the kind of legal evasion that men of property often employed when their own errors of judgment were part of the record. He had answered every question directly, including the ones that were uncomfortable. He did not attempt to minimize his own role in the circumstances that made this fraud possible, Booth wrote. I have worked with many men in his position, and most of them cannot manage that. He managed it. Eleanor read that paragraph slowly. She folded the letter. She sat at her father's desk with her hands in her lap and the May morning coming through the windows. Outside, she could hear June's voice with the younger children, the particular patient cadence of someone teaching a child to form a letter for the first time. She felt something move through her that she could not fully name. Not triumph. Not vindication exactly. Something quieter than both of those. Something that felt like the end of a held breath. Like a knot loosening that she had not quite realized she'd been carrying. She wrote to Booth, thanking him for his work and his letter. She wrote to Thomas, telling him the outcome and asking him to please tell the South Pasture tenants directly, because they deserved to hear it from someone who had been in the house with them through it. She wrote to her cousin in Philadelphia with the news and with genuine gratitude for the introduction to Booth. She wrote to Dora, "Tell me how he is." Same 4 words as December. Different weight to them now. Toy. Dora's reply arrived a week later, and this time she answered the question directly. As if she had been waiting for Eleanor to mean it the way she now meant it. He has changed, Dora wrote. I do not say improved, because that word implies I know what he was supposed to be. I say changed. He rides the lease farms himself every week. He dismissed the 2 men Mercer had placed here, and he has been slower about replacing them, more careful about who he trusts with what. He sat with old Samuel for 2 hours last Tuesday, which he has not done in years, just talking the way he used to when he was a boy. He does not speak of Miss Mercer. He does not speak of himself much either, which is new. He used to fill rooms with himself without meaning to. He is quieter now. Whether that is grief or growth I cannot say. Perhaps both. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table with her coffee. The chestnut trees on the south wall were fully leafed now, barely making shade yet, but promising it. She had checked them that morning the way she checked all the growing things, with the particular combination of hope and patience that farming required. She wrote back about Caleb, who had graduated from the primer, and was now reading anything he could get his hands on, and had recently declared his intention to become a lawyer, which had caused Eleanor to have to put her hand over her mouth to contain something between a laugh and a sob. She wrote about Margaret's daughter, who had the mathematical instinct of a natural surveyor. She wrote about the school, which had grown to 14 children, and which she was beginning to think needed a proper building before the next winter. She did not write about Nathaniel, but she had started to think about him differently. Not with the careful avoidance she had practiced all winter, the deliberate turning away, the discipline of not asking Dora certain questions, the letters that covered everything except the subject that was always underneath everything. Now she thought about him, the way you think about a wound that has stopped being acute and become something else. Something that still aches, but differently. Something you can touch without flinching as hard. She was not ready to name what that meant. She thought instead about what Dora had written, quieter now. Nathaniel, who had always filled rooms without meaning to. Nathaniel, who had walked into a dining room 6 years ago at a neighbor's supper party, and Eleanor's father had leaned over and said quietly, "That young Ashford is going to be a great man or a terrible one, and I'm not sure he knows which yet." Her father had been right about that. He had been right about most things, her father. She missed him with the steady, familiar ache of someone who has had a long time to learn to carry a loss. She wondered what her father would make of all this. Of the farmhouse and the school and the chestnut trees and the locked drawer that was no longer locked because everything in it had served its purpose. She thought he would approve of the school. She thought he would have complicated feelings about the rest. He had liked Nathaniel in the guarded way of a man who saw both the possibility and the danger in another man, and was not certain which would win. She thought he might have said, "Give it time, Eleanor. Give it time and watch what he does with it." She was watching. June arrived warm and unhurried the way Virginia Junes do, with the kind of heat that comes on slowly and doesn't apologize for itself. Eleanor had taken to doing her correspondence in the early mornings before the day got heavy, and it was during one of these early mornings that she received the most unexpected letter of the entire enterprise. It was from Caroline Mercer. She almost didn't open it. She sat with it in her hands for 10 minutes, first turning it over, recognizing the handwriting from the return address, deciding twice that she wasn't going to read it, and then changing her mind. She opened it. It was 3 pages long, and it was the most honest letter Eleanor had ever received from someone she had no reason to expect honesty from. Caroline wrote that she had heard about the court outcome. She wrote that she had known since December earlier, if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be, that her father was not the kind of man she had told herself he was. She had told herself that his methods were his business, and his success was the part that mattered, and that the people who were cautious about him simply didn't understand the way commerce worked. She had told herself this because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative, Caroline wrote, being that I was willing to let my father do what he did because it benefited me, and that I did not ask questions because I did not want answers. She wrote about Nathaniel. She wrote carefully and without self-serving revision. She had seen what she wanted in him and had not looked at what the cost of it would be for the people it came at the expense of. I was not cruel intentionally, she wrote. I am not sure that makes it better. I think it might make it worse, actually. Cruelty with awareness is at least honest about itself. She wrote, I do not expect forgiveness from you, Mrs. Whitmore. I am not writing for that. I am writing because I have been trying to become the kind of woman who tells the truth even when it does not help her, and this is part of that. You conducted yourself with more dignity than I understood at the time. I understand it now. Eleanor sat with those 3 pages for a long time. Then she wrote back, 1 page. She wrote that she had read the letter carefully. She wrote that she did not hold Caroline responsible for her father's choices, though she held her responsible for her own. She wrote that honesty was not comfortable to practice and was worth practicing anyway. She wrote that she wished her well. She sealed the letter. She felt something release. Not in relation to Caroline specifically, that was already released, had been for months, but something broader, something about the shape of all of it. The way a story, when it is close to being finished, begins to feel different from when you are inside the middle of it. Like the weather changing before a storm passes. It was Thomas who told her in a letter at the end of June that Nathaniel had ridden out to each of the South Pasture lease farms personally after the court ruling. One at a time, without a lawyer, without a formal arrangement, without anyone accompanying him. Just him and a horse and whatever he had decided he needed to say. Thomas had heard it from Robert Alderton, who had come to the house the day after to tell Thomas, not Nathaniel Thomas, because he had wanted to tell someone who would appreciate what it meant. Nathaniel had apparently sat down with each family at their table and told them directly what had happened. Not the legal version Booth had sent the official notifications. The human version. What Mercer had done, how it had been discovered, and what Nathaniel intended to do going forward with the lease terms to make certain that the families standing on that land was never again left in a position where it could be threatened by his own poor judgment. He had also, Robert told Thomas, apologized. Not for Mercer's fraud, which was not his fault to apologize for. For the months before the fraud became visible, when the changing terms and the uneasy dealings had made the families feel uncertain about their future, and when Nathaniel had been too absorbed in his own difficulties to notice or address what was happening to theirs. He didn't have to do that, Robert had told Thomas. He could have just sent the paper saying we're all right. He didn't have to come sit at our table. Thomas wrote, I thought you should know this, ma'am. You asked me to watch what he does. I am watching. Eleanor read that letter 3 times. She set it on the windowsill with the chestnut trees behind it in the frame of the glass. She stood at the window for a while, She thought about a man who could sit down at a tenant farmer's table without his title and his position and his inheritance propping him up and apologize for something he had not done, but had failed to prevent. She thought about what it cost to do that. She thought about the Nathaniel she had known, the one who had filled rooms without meaning to, the one who ran from honesty, because honesty required him to look at himself without the comfortable buffer of his own certainty. That man would not have ridden to 3 farmhouses. That man would have sent Booth's letter and considered the matter resolved. This man had ridden to 3 farmhouses. She turned away from the window. She had school to run and accounts to review, and Margaret had flagged a problem with the north fence that needed attention before the summer got further along. She was building something. She had been building it for a year now, and it was becoming visible, the shape of it, the way the shape of a house becomes visible once the bones are up, even before the walls are filled in. She did not have room yet for what she was beginning to feel, but she stopped dismissing it. The letter from Nathaniel arrived on the 2nd of July. She had not expected it. She had half believed after the court proceedings that the practical necessity of their correspondence had ended, and that they would return to the clean separation she had maintained through the winter, not with hostility, not with grief, but with the respectful distance of 2 people who had closed a chapter and were each reading different books now. His handwriting on the envelope changed the quality of the morning before she opened it. She took it inside. She sat at her father's desk. She opened it. It was not about the court. It was not about Booth or the South Pasture or William Mercer, who was by the latest account from Thomas under investigation by the county sheriff and unlikely to be operating in Virginia for some time. It was about none of that. It was 2 pages in his angular, slightly rushed hand, and it started without preamble, the way his mind always moved when he was being honest, directly without the social warm-up that most men use to soften what they actually meant. "Eleanor," he wrote, "I have been trying to write this letter since May. I have written it 4 times and discarded it 4 times, because each version sounded like something a man says when he wants to be forgiven, and I told you in March that I was not writing to ask for that, and I meant it. I am still not asking for forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. What I want is harder to name, and I am going to try to name it, because I have been learning slowly, and not gracefully, that the things I avoid naming are the things that do the most damage. I think about the morning I sat across that table from you. I think about the fact that you did not cry, which I told myself was dignity, but which I now believe was something else, something more like a decision. You had already decided before you came downstairs that you were going to survive whatever I was about to do. You had already decided what kind of woman you were going to be. I was 34 years old, and I did not know what kind of man I was going to be. I thought I did. I thought it was settled, the estate, the name, the position. I thought those things were what I was. I have spent the past year discovering that I was the things I did, not the things I was given." He wrote about the lease farm visits. He wrote about them plainly, without presenting them as evidence of his own virtue. He wrote about being nervous on the road to Robert Alderton's farm, which Eleanor had not expected him to admit. He wrote that he had sat at Robert's table and looked at a man who had trusted him with 40 years of his family's livelihood and had felt for the first time in his adult life the full weight of what trust actually cost the person who was doing the trusting. I do not think I knew that before he wrote. I thought I did. I thought managing the estate well and keeping the leases fair was fulfilling my obligation. I did not understand that the obligation also required me to pay attention, to notice when the people I was responsible for were uneasy. You noticed. You always noticed. I told myself you were being excessive or sentimental, or that you did not understand the practical pressures I was working under. I was wrong. He wrote, "I am not the man who sat at that table last summer. I cannot prove that to you. I can only tell you it is true, and leave you to decide what, if anything, to do with it." And then at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the slightly different writing that she had come to recognize as the writing he did when he was moving faster than he was comfortable with, "I would very much like to come and see you if you are willing. Not to ask for anything. I would like to see the farm. I have heard through various correspondents who apparently keep you well informed about my behavior, and keep you even better informed about everything you are building, that you have done something remarkable there. I would like to see it with my own eyes. I would like to see you. But I will not come unless you want me to, and I will not interpret silence as permission." Eleanor sat very still. The July morning was coming in warm through the windows. Outside, she could hear Caleb's voice in the yard. He had started coming early on school days, ostensibly to help her with the door that stuck in the humidity. Actually, because he liked the quiet of the early morning, and the chance to read undisturbed before the other children arrived. She read the letter again. She read it a third time. She thought about what Dora had written quieter now. She thought about what Booth had written. "He is not what I expected." She thought about Thomas watching and reporting with the faithful exactitude of a man who had served one family for 40 years and understood, without being able to articulate it, that what he was watching mattered. She thought about her father, who had said that Nathaniel Ashford was going to be a great man or a terrible one, and wasn't sure he knew which yet. She thought she knew now. Or she was beginning to know. She was not going to rush toward it. She had learned this past year that rushing toward things was how you ended up in positions you hadn't examined properly. She had learned to let things arrive at the pace they arrived at, to trust the shape of things coming clear rather than forcing clarity before it was ready. But she was not going to turn away from this. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "You may come. Sunday afternoon if that suits. The farm is not what you are used to, but it is what it is, and I am not apologetic about it. Come alone. E.W." She read it over. She did not change anything. She sealed it before she could revise it. She set it with the outgoing mail. Then she went to the door of the farmhouse, and she stood for a moment with the July morning around her. The heat already building the chestnut trees, making their small new shade. Caleb's voice from the yard where he was reading aloud to himself the way he always did when he thought no one was listening, and she breathed. She had been building something for a year. She could feel the shape of it around her. The farmhouse and the school and the women she had hired and the children she had taught and the locked drawer that was unlocked now. And the letters in the outgoing mail that had gone to Richmond and Philadelphia and Ashford Estate, and one surprising afternoon to an address in Fredericksburg for Caroline Mercer. She had built all of that. Whatever was coming on Sunday, she did not know yet what it was going to be. She was not going to decide what it was going to be before it arrived. She was going to let Nathaniel Ashford come to her farm on a Sunday afternoon in July, and she was going to look at him with clear eyes and no prior conclusions, and she was going to see what was actually there. She was the kind of woman who kept building. She was beginning to remember the kind of woman who knew the difference between a wall and a door. She had spent a year learning which was which. Caleb's voice drifted in from the yard he was reading, something with real words, now real sentences, the kind of text that had been closed to him 18 months ago, and that he was moving through now with the determined pleasure of someone who has just discovered what they are capable of. Eleanor listened for a moment. Then she went inside to begin the day. He arrived on a Sunday as agreed. Eleanor knew he was coming. She had known since she sealed the letter that said "You may come," and she had spent the intervening days telling herself she was not preparing for it. She was doing what she always did. She was running the school and reviewing the accounts and checking the north fence that Margaret had flagged and planting the second row of fall vegetables. She was living her life. She was also, if she was being honest, and she had made herself a rule about honesty, that she intended to keep acutely aware of every day between Wednesday and Sunday. She did not ask Dora what time he was likely to leave. She did not arrange anything special. She wore the same dress she wore on any working Sunday, the blue wool one that was practical and clean, and that she had never particularly thought about before, and which she now thought about, and then decided deliberately to wear anyway, because she was not going to perform anything for Nathaniel Ashford. If there was going to be anything between them, it was going to be built on exactly what was real. And what was real was a woman in a blue working dress on a farm in the Shenandoah Valley who had spent a year becoming herself. She heard the horse on the road at 2:30 in the afternoon. She was at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger when she heard it, and she did not close the ledger, and she did not stand up immediately. She waited until she heard him stop in the yard, until she heard him tie the horse to the post she had put in specifically for visitors. She had put it in 2 months ago, before she had any particular visitor in mind. Because June had pointed out that people coming to the school needed somewhere to tie their horses. And then she closed the ledger, stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to the door. She opened it before he knocked. He was standing 3 feet from the door with his hat in his hands, which she had not expected. Nathaniel Ashford had spent 34 years of his life walking through doors like he owned them, because he usually did. He had spent 34 years wearing his authority the way other men wore their coats naturally, without thinking about it. He had not, in her experience of him, stood outside a door with his hat in his hands. He looked different. Not diminished, she had braced herself, some part of her, for the particular deflation of a man whose fortune and position had been badly shaken, the hollowed-out look she had seen on her father's face in the years after the bad harvest. That was not what she saw. He looked like someone who had been through something and had come out on the other side of it without the armor he'd gone in with. He looked. She reached for the word and found it present. Like he was standing exactly where he was standing and not also simultaneously performing being somewhere. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. "Come in." Dumped. She put coffee on. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair across from where she'd been sitting, and he looked around the kitchen with the careful attention of a man who understood he was in someone else's place and was not going to behave as though he weren't. She noticed him notice the ledger. The school primers stacked at the end of the table. The letters in a neat pile by the window, ready to go out tomorrow. The unlocked drawer in the desk visible through the doorway of the next room. She set the coffee down. She sat across from him. They looked at each other. It was the first time she had seen his face since the morning in the dining room, and she had thought she was ready for it, and she was mostly right. Mostly. There was a moment, just a moment, where the sight of him hit the place below her sternum where she had done most of her grieving, and she felt the echo of it, the ghost of the weight she had carried. She let it move through and kept her face still. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. It was true, and they both knew it was true, which made it a better kind of statement than the social version of the same words. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to see me." "I wasn't sure I would either," she said. Then I decided that uncertainty wasn't a good enough reason not to. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more serious than a smile. That is very much how you think." "It's how I've always thought," she said. "You knew that." "I did," he said. He stopped. He set the cup down. He looked at her directly in the way she had been wondering, without quite admitting she was wondering whether he still could. Whether the year and everything in it had changed or softened the quality of his attention, which had always been, even in the difficult times, one of the things she had most valued about him. "I want to say something before we talk about anything else. I've been trying to figure out how to say it since May, and I haven't managed to write it right. So I'm going to say it instead, and probably do that wrong too, but here it is." Eleanor waited. "What you did," he said. "The records, Booth, the Alderton family coming to you because they had nowhere else to go. The fact that they came to you, I know what that cost. Not the effort. I know you're capable of the effort. I mean, what it cost to help me. After everything." He pressed his hands flat on the table, and she recognized the gesture. It was the same one he made when he was working to keep himself very still. "I don't have words for what that is. I've been trying to find them for months, and they don't exist in any form that feels adequate. I'm not going to pretend I've found them." Eleanor looked at him. She took her time. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I know," he said immediately. "I know that. The Alderton family, the lease farms, 40 years of people's lives." "Yes," she said. "But you also could have written anonymously to Booth," he said. "You could have set it in motion and stepped away from it and never written to me at all, and it would have come out the same for the families." She had no answer for that, because it was true. "You wrote to me," he said. "You didn't have to do that." The kitchen was quiet. From outside she could hear a bird in the chestnut trees, some small, insistent sound she couldn't identify. "No," she said finally. I didn't. She picked up her coffee. She took a moment. She set it down. I wrote to you, she said, because I had information you needed, and because I am not the kind of person who withholds something useful out of spite. And because... She stopped. She was going to say it plainly because she had made herself a rule about honesty, and she intended to keep it. Because I was not finished caring what happened to you. I wanted to be finished. I tried to be finished. I wasn't. He was very still across the table. I'm not telling you that as an invitation, she said clearly. I'm telling you because you came here and you sat at this table and you said you wanted honesty, and I believe you mean it, and honesty requires me to say what's actually true instead of the version I'm more comfortable with. All right, he said, quiet, like a man receiving something he doesn't trust himself to handle carelessly. I want to show you something, Eleanor said. She stood up. She went to the door and she called toward the yard, and Caleb looked up from where he was reading on the fence post he had taken to coming by on Sundays as well, now ostensibly to help with the horses actually, because the farmhouse had become, over the course of a year, the place where he most wanted to be. Caleb, she said, come meet someone. Caleb came in with the easy confidence of a boy who was comfortable in this particular kitchen and politely uncertain about the stranger at the table. He was 11 years old, and he stood straight, and he looked Nathaniel in the eye because Eleanor had taught him that looking people in the eye was both courtesy and information. This is Caleb, Eleanor said. He is my best student, and he intends to become a lawyer. Nathaniel looked at the boy. Something shifted in his face. Something that was not performance, not the careful social attention of a man who knew how to be charming to the right people. Something genuine. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, Caleb said. Mrs. Whitmore says that the law is only as good as the people willing to use it for something real. I intend to use it for something real. Nathaniel turned and looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes and said nothing. He looked back at Caleb. That's about the most sensible thing I've heard said about the law, he said, and I spent 2 days in a Richmond courtroom recently. Caleb considered this with the gravity of a boy who takes compliments seriously. Were you the one who caught the man forging the deeds? He asked. Nathaniel went slightly still. You know about that. Mrs. Whitmore told us, Caleb said simply. She said it was a lesson in why property records matter, and why every man ought to know what's in them. He looked at Nathaniel with the direct assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to disguise his curiosity. She didn't say it was you, sir, but I figured it out. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor again. He figures most things out, she said. After Caleb went back to the yard, Nathaniel sat quietly for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly different than before. Lower. More careful. How many children are in the school? 14, she said. I need a proper building before winter. I've been saving for it. I'd like to help with that, he said. She looked at him. Not as... He stopped. Started again. Not as anything other than what it is. Children who need a schoolhouse getting a schoolhouse. That's all. I'll think about it, she said. She meant no. He heard that she meant no. He nodded once, accepting it, and did not push, and that the not pushing was the first moment when something inside Eleanor that had been braced since Wednesday quietly released. They walked the farm after the coffee. She had not planned to offer it, and then she had because he had asked to see it, and she had said in her letter that it was what it was, and she was not apologetic about it, and walking it with him seemed like the right way to mean that. She showed him the south field and the tobacco barn where the birds still lived in their corner, and the well with its replaced rope. She showed him the chestnut trees. He looked at them for a long time. You planted these in December, he said. It wasn't a question. Dora had apparently been thorough in her correspondence in both directions. November, she said. Late November. Most people said it was too late. Most people, he said. Were wrong, she said. He looked at the trees, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the July afternoon went on around them, warm and unhurried, with the birds still in the chestnuts, and the horses moving in the yard, and Caleb's voice drifting over from wherever he had gotten to. "I want to tell you something," Nathaniel said. He was still looking at the trees. "And I need you to know that I understand it changes nothing. I'm not saying it to change anything. I'm saying it because I've been trying to be honest, and this is part of what honesty requires." Eleanor waited. He turned and looked at her. "I have not had one day in the past year," he said, "where I did not think about the morning at that table. Not one. And I'm not talking about regret the way a man regrets a bad business decision. I'm talking about the kind of thing that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and makes you just lie there, knowing. The way you know something that you can't unknow." She held his gaze. She did not move toward it, and she did not move away from it. "I know I hurt you," he said. "I know I did it in front of your household and your people, and I know I made you walk out of a house that should have been your home. And I know that the things I told myself about why the estate, the pressure, the debts, the future, I know now that they were partly true and mostly cowardice. And I live with that." "Yes," she said. "I imagine you do." He nodded. He had not expected her to soften it. She had not. "Good," she said. And then, because she meant it and because honesty ran in both directions. "Not because I want you to suffer, because I want you to understand it. Those are different things." "I know they are," he said. "I'm learning the difference." They stood by the chestnut trees for another moment. Then Eleanor turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, and he followed, and the afternoon continued. He stayed 3 hours. In the last hour, Margaret came back from the south field and met him with the frank appraisal of a woman who had no reason to be impressed by anyone's name or position, and who was measuring him by entirely different criteria. Eleanor watched Margaret decide over the course of about 4 minutes that he was acceptable. She knew because Margaret stopped being careful with him and started being herself, which was the highest compliment Margaret had to offer. June came by with her daughter, and regarded Nathaniel with the same patient long-distance assessment she applied to everything, and said almost nothing, and as she was leaving, said to Eleanor quietly enough that it might not have been meant to carry, "He's got good hands, working hands." Eleanor did not ask what June meant by that. She had learned to trust June's assessments. When it was time for him to go, Nathaniel stood in the yard and put his hat back on and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who had more to say, and had decided to say none of it today, which was itself a kind of evidence. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "Thank you for coming as yourself," she said, rather than the other version. He understood exactly what she meant. "I'm working on making that permanent," he said. "I noticed," she said. He mounted the horse. He looked down at her for a moment, and she looked back. Something passed between them that she could not name precisely, but that she recognized the specific quality of two people who have a history and are carefully and without rushing trying to figure out whether they also have a future. "May I come again?" he asked. She thought about it. 2 weeks, she said. "Right first." He nodded. He tipped his hat. He rode out. Eleanor stood in the yard until she couldn't hear the horse anymore. Then she turned around, and Caleb was sitting on the fence with his book and looking at her with the expression of a boy who has observed everything and formed opinions and is deciding whether to share them. "Well," Eleanor said. "He's all right," Caleb said with the particular gravity of an 11-year-old delivering a serious verdict. He listened more than he talked. "That's a good sign in a person." Eleanor looked at him. "You are going to make a very fine lawyer," she said. Caleb grinned a rare, full, unguarded grin and went back to his book. He came back in 2 weeks as she had said. He wrote first as she had required, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that. By the 4th visit they had stopped making formal occasions of it. He came in the afternoon. She was usually working on something. He would ask what needed doing, and she would tell him, and he would do it without commentary, without performing helpfulness, just doing the work the way a person does when they are genuinely trying to be useful rather than to appear useful. He fixed the door that stuck in the humidity which Caleb had been managing with brute force for months. He replaced 2 boards in the tobacco barn that had gone soft. He spent an entire Sunday afternoon at the north fence that Margaret had flagged in June, and which Eleanor had been patching rather than properly repairing because she hadn't had time to give it a full day. He was good with his hands. June had seen it immediately. Eleanor filed that observation away and let it mean what it meant. They talked those afternoons. Not about the past, not directly, not yet. They talked about the farm, and the school, and the children, especially Caleb, who had appointed himself Nathaniel's formal critic and delivered ongoing assessments of his progress with the solemnity of a judge. They talked about the lease farms and what Nathaniel was doing differently with the management now. They talked about his mother, who was living with her sister in the Piedmont, and who had written him a letter after the court ruling that had apparently said in the careful language of a woman who did not waste words, "Your father would be relieved. I am proud of you for a different reason." They talked about Eleanor's father, whom Nathaniel had met twice and thought about more than he had admitted at the time. "He looked at me," Nathaniel said on a Sunday in August, "like he knew exactly which way I was going to go, and wasn't sure he approved of the odds." "He wasn't sure," Eleanor said. "He told me so." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I thought you were worth the bet," she said. She said it simply without softening it or dramatizing it, just the fact of it. "I was 22 years old, and I believed that completely." He sat with that. She let him. "I want to be worth it," he said finally. "Not in retrospect. Now. I want to be worth it going forward." "I know," she said. "I've been watching." September arrived, and with it the question Eleanor had been circling without landing on all summer. It came to a head on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of September, when Nathaniel was at the farmhouse, and Caleb had gone home, and Margaret and June were both away, and the late summer quiet settled around the farmhouse in a way that felt like the afternoon itself was waiting for something. They were at the kitchen table, which had become their place. The kitchen table at the center of everything that had been built here over the past year. Nathaniel had brought her a book from Richmond, a practical manual on school construction that he had tracked down through some contact of his cousin's, and she had been reading it while he finished the coffee, and neither of them had said anything for 20 minutes. It was Nathaniel who broke the silence. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me if asking it is wrong. If this is too soon or too much or not what you want, I need you to say so directly, and I will hear it." She set the book down. She looked at him. "I am not the man you married," he said. "I want to be clear about that, because I am not asking you to go back to what we were. I know what we were. I know what I did with what we were, and I know that going back to it would be asking you to stand in the same place where you were hurt and pretend the ground is different now. I'm not asking for that." She said nothing. She was listening. "I am asking," he said, and his voice was careful and stripped of everything except what was actually true, whether there is any version of forward that includes me. Not a question of marriage, or position, or what the county thinks, or what anyone else needs from either of us. Just you and I going forward as whatever we actually are to each other now, whether there's room for that. The September morning was around them. The chestnut trees outside the window were turning, just beginning the first edge of color coming in. Eleanor looked at the man across the table, not the man she had married as he had said, but not a stranger either. Something between. Something that required a new name. She thought about her father, who had not been sure about the odds. She thought about June's grandmother. A woman's got to decide what she's the kind of woman who does. She thought about herself this past year. The well rope and the fence and the school and the 14 children and the locked drawer that was unlocked now and the chestnut trees that people said were planted too late and which had come in stronger than anyone expected. She thought about what she had told Robert Alderton, that February morning dignity isn't something a person gives you and it isn't something they can take. She thought about all the things she had built and she thought about what it meant to be a woman who kept building. Whether that meant building alone indefinitely, or whether it meant something more complicated. Whether building alone was a principle, or whether it had become somewhere in the past few months a habit she was maintaining past its usefulness. She looked at Nathaniel Ashford, who was sitting across her kitchen table with his hat off and his hands still, and his eyes on her with the full quality of attention she had always valued. And she told herself the truth about what she felt when he rode into the yard on Sundays. She told herself the truth about the past 4 visits, and what it had meant to watch him fix the door, and replace the barn boards, and spend a whole afternoon on the north fence without being asked twice. She told herself the truth about the letter he had written in July, the one with the different handwriting at the bottom, the one she had read 4 times, and which was, she could admit this, now still in the drawer of her father's desk. She said, "I'm not ready to call it anything yet." He nodded. He had expected that. "But yes," she said, "there's room." He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, what was there was not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter and more serious than either the expression of a man who has been handed something fragile and understands exactly what fragile means. "I won't take it for granted," he said. "No," she said, "you won't. Because if you do, I will tell you directly and immediately, and we will deal with it directly and immediately, and you will not enjoy it." "I know," he said. And then, for the first time since he had started coming on Sundays, he smiled. It was the smile she remembered, the rare one, the one that came from somewhere real, and it hit her somewhere undefended, and she let it. "Good," she said, and picked up the school construction manual and went back to reading it. Benisheg. October came, and with it a letter from Dora that arrived on a Thursday morning and made Eleanor laugh out loud for the first time in longer than she could remember. Dora had written in her careful, slightly tilted hand that old Samuel's knee was better, and that the kitchen garden had come in well despite the late summer heat, and that Lena had finally settled the argument with the housemaids about the linen cupboard in a manner that Dora described as firm and permanently conclusive. And then at the bottom of the 3rd page, in the compressed sentences that Dora used when she was trying to be matter-of-fact about something she was not remotely matter-of-fact about, "I understand from various indications too numerous to list that Mr. Ashford has been spending his Sunday afternoons in Shenandoah County. I say nothing about this, except that he comes back from those Sundays a different man than the one who left, and the house is easier on Monday mornings than it has been in a very long time. I thought you might like to know that, Miss Eleanor. I thought you might like to know that whatever you are building out there, the effects of it reach further than your fence line." Eleanor read that paragraph twice. She sat at her kitchen table with Dora's letter in her hands, and the October morning around her, and the chestnut trees outside, making their last color before the cold came in, and she thought about what Dora had written. About effects reaching past fence lines. About things built in one place that changed the quality of the air somewhere else. She thought about the morning she had folded the coat with the initials and handed it to Dora and said, "Give it to Thomas's youngest boy." She had thought that morning that she was ending something. She had thought she was setting down the last thing she had been holding and walking away with her hands empty. Her hands were not empty. She wrote back to Dora about the school construction. She had decided to accept a contribution toward the building, but not from Nathaniel. From 6 families in the county who had children in the school and who had organized themselves without being asked into a building committee. She had received the proposal from Robert Alderton, who had arrived with his hat in his hands again, except this time his eyes were bright with something that was not anxiety. "We want to build it right," he'd said. "Proper walls, proper floor, something that lasts. Mrs. Whitmore, you gave our children something last year that none of us could give them ourselves. This is what we know how to do back." She had accepted. She told Dora this. She told her about Caleb, who had decided he wanted to specialize in property law, which Eleanor found either deeply ironic or deeply appropriate, and had settled on appropriate. She told Dora about Margaret's daughter, who was now coming 5 days a week, and who had recently solved a geometry problem that Eleanor herself had to think about for 3 minutes. She told her that the chestnut trees were turning. She told her she was well. She sealed the letter. She held it for a moment before she put it down. She was well. That was still true. It was more true than it had been in September. More true than it had been in the spring. She was building something that had dimensions she hadn't planned for when she started a school and a farm and a community of women and children and neighbors who had become over the course of a year the texture of a real life, and now carefully, and without rushing, a man who came on Sundays and fixed things and listened more than he talked and was learning, as she had once believed he was capable of learning, to be someone worth trusting. She was not the woman who had sat in the side parlor sewing his initials into a coat lining. She was not the woman who had walked out of that dining room telling herself she only needed her hands empty and her spine straight. She was something she had not been before, something she was still becoming, which was not a weakness, but the most honest description of any person who was alive and paying attention. She put the letter with the outgoing mail. She went to the window and looked at the chestnut trees. The last Sunday of October, Nathaniel came as he always did in the afternoon after writing first. He came in and they had coffee, and he spent an hour with Caleb going over the boys' questions about the Richmond court proceedings, which Caleb had been saving up with the focused intensity of someone preparing a legal brief. Eleanor sat at the other end of the table and pretended to read the school construction proposals and listened to Nathaniel answer every question, directly including the ones about his own mistakes, with the same stripped honesty he had been practicing all summer. At one point, Caleb looked up from his notes and said, "Sir, you weren't the villain in this story, were you? You were more like the person who had to learn the hard way." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at Eleanor. She looked back. "Yes," he said. "That's about right." "Mrs. Whitmore says those are often the most important characters," Caleb said, "because they change, and change is the only thing that actually moves a story forward." Eleanor set down the construction proposals. "Caleb," she said, "I think it might be time to add philosophy to your curriculum." He grinned his rare full grin and went back to his notes. After Caleb left and the afternoon went long and gold, the way late October afternoons do in Virginia, Nathaniel and Eleanor stood by the chestnut trees. The leaves were almost fully turned. In another week, they would be starting to fall. "Next spring," Eleanor said, "they'll make real shade." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'd like to see that." She looked at him. He meant more than the trees. She knew that. She let it mean more than the trees. "I'll write you in the spring," she said. "When they come back in." His expression held everything he did not say, and everything he was not going to rush her to say. "I'll be watching for it," he said. He put his hat on. He tipped it to her, the gesture of a man acknowledging a woman he genuinely respected. The kind of thing you did not perform, the kind you either meant or you didn't. And he walked to his horse. She watched him ride out. She stood in the yard for a moment after the sound of the horse faded. The October afternoon was cooling. Somewhere in the chestnut trees, the last bird of the season was making its last sound of the day, small, insistent, certain. She thought about what she had said to Nathaniel that September morning, "There's room." She thought about the year behind her. The well rope and the fence boards and the flour sack of early correspondence and the locked drawer and Harlan Booth's 8 words that had arrived on a Thursday morning and made her breathe for the first time in months. The school and the children and Margaret and June and Robert Alderton and his hat. Dora's letters on the windowsill. Thomas watching and reporting with faithful exactitude. The chestnut trees planted when everyone said it was too late. She thought about what room meant. How it started as a small thing. There's room, and grew. The way trees grew. The way anything you tended and gave time to grew into something that provided shelter. She was building something. She had been building it for a year, and she knew its shape now, not the final shape, because nothing that is alive has a final shape, but the shape it was becoming. Strong. Real, entirely hers, and there was room in it, she had decided, for a man who had learned the hard way, who came on Sundays, who listened more than he talked, who had ridden to 3 farmhouses with his hat in his hands and apologized without asking for anything back. There was room for a man who was still becoming someone worth trusting, and who knew that the becoming was the point. There was room in a life built with both hands and clear eyes, and the kind of honesty that cost something for love that had been broken down and was being rebuilt from better materials by people who now knew what they were actually building and why it mattered. Eleanor Whitmore turned away from the road. She went inside her farmhouse. She sat down at her father's desk. She opened the drawer that was never locked anymore, and she took out Nathaniel's July letter, the one with the different handwriting at the bottom. She read the last lines again. "I am trying to learn to sit with it." She folded it. She put it back. She picked up her pen. She had accounts to finish and a school building to plan, and a letter to Dora to write, and 14 children coming on Monday morning who needed a teacher who showed up with both hands and a clear head, and the absolute conviction that what they were doing in that room together mattered. She had a life that was entirely, completely without apology hers, and she had written in the careful, angular hand of a man learning to mean what he said, a letter that told her the door she had chosen to leave open was worth leaving open. She began to write. Outside, the last bird in the chestnut trees went quiet. The October evening came on warm and slow and full, the way good things do when they have finally been given enough time. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had walked out of a dining room one summer morning with nothing but her spine straight and her hands empty, who had planted trees in the wrong season and built a school out of a farmhouse room and taught a boy with no letters to read, like he intended to change the world, sat at her father's desk in the light of a late October evening and wrote and did not look back and was not afraid of what was coming. Because she had built something that could hold it, and that in the end was everything.